Welcome to the latest episode of Lean In Leander. So the topic on many people's minds at this point in the year is taxes. And seeing as though the filing deadline just passed a few days ago, I thought it would be appropriate to take a look at what exactly is a tax increase, framed in the lens of the upcoming LISD bond election. Now, there's a couple of things that this particular bond is addressing, and we'll go into some of those details momentarily, but the primary issue, I think, on many people's minds is whether or not this is a tax increase. And that got me thinking a little bit about some of the things that have come to pass over the past few years as it relates to these types of bonds and these types of elections or voting processes that are put forth in front of our citizens here in Leander and in the greater LISD region, if you will. Now, one of the things that I think is really important to note in this process is that it is a requirement of the state legislature that any bond have language that indicates it is a tax increase. I wanted to dive into that a little bit more. HB 3 was an education bill passed by the 86th legislature in Texas in the year 2019. The bill made a significant change to the state's public education system, including school finance, teacher compensation, and early childhood education. That same session saw the addition of SB 1252, which added a requirement that if a proposition is submitted to voters in Texas for the approval of a imposition or increase of tax rate for cities, counties, or special purpose districts, then the ballot must include the phrase, "This is a tax increase," in prominent font size, uppercase letters, and bolded text. There are a few real-world implications of this change to consider, including the tax increase language on the ballot can increase the transparency and inform voters about the potential financial impact of any proposition. Voters may be more likely to carefully consider their decision to approve or reject a tax increase when the potential financial impact is clearly communicated. However, the language, "This is a tax increase," may be perceived as overly simplistic and potentially misleading to some voters. It may not adequately convey the complexity and nuances of the proposed tax increase and its potential benefits, such as funding for public services like schools, healthcare, and infrastructure. The language requirements may also increase voter awareness and engagement in local elections. By highlighting the potential tax increase on the ballot, more voters may be motivated to participate in the election process and express their opinion. The language may also have a negative emotional influence on voters, potentially creating a knee-jerk reaction to the vote against the proposition, regardless of the specifics of the proposed tax increase or its potential benefits. The use of such language could potentially influence voter behavior and result in a lower approval rate for such tax increases. Some voters may be more inclined to vote against a proposition when they see the "This is a tax increase" language on the ballot, regardless of the specific merits of the proposition itself. In some cases, voters may not fully understand the impact of a tax increase and the services or programs that may be funded by the additional revenue. Adding this language to the ballot may further complicate voters' understandings of propositions and potentially confuse them. The language may be perceived as having a political motivation or bias, which could erode trust in the election process or the institutions that administer it. And finally, adding the "This is the tax increase" language to the ballot also can result in an increase in printing costs for local governments and special purpose districts that must prepare the ballots. The cost of printing ballots with this required language may need to be factored into budgets for these entities. Conversations that I'm personally involved with are revolving around the economic development going on in and around Leander. As our city continues to grow and more people continue to come to the city, as many of you know, we've talked about this before, it's one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. There are issues that come with that, obviously. The type of development that we're doing, how does it affect our tax base, things of that nature. More specifically, I wanted to talk a little bit about how a very strong school district is what draws people to the area in the first place. And as many of you will account, I personally don't have the experience here in Leander, having moved here after my kids finished school, but many of you will account to the high level of education and engagement that LISD as a district brings to the students who are attending the schools. Part of that process includes us as citizens to continue to invest in that future. And by simply boiling it down to a simple equation of is this a tax increase or is this not a tax increase is fundamentally, in my opinion, not really the conversation that we should be having. The conversation should be how much do we value the education, security, safety, and future of the children who are currently involved in our school districts, as well as do we as a community feel that it's important to invest in that school district to draw people to our area for economic development. I think when you start to frame things in that manner, you get a completely different answer to the equation. To better understand the equation today, we only need to go back a couple of years. In 2021, 2 out of 3 bond measures failed when put in front of the electorate. Voters approved Proposition B at that time, which provided funding of $33.3 million to replace technology devices, but voted down Propositions A and C, which would have funded new construction, renovations, and technology infrastructure projects. One of the factors that I like to consider when looking at these types of issues is exactly how many people are showing up to vote. Now, when we take a look at the population in Leander in that time frame around 2021, we can anticipate there was about 60 to 62,000 people in the area at the time. However, when you look at the actual voting numbers, there was only a 33% of that population, which I think translates to the general area, that showed up to the polls and actually voted. In 2021, LISD had 13 schools with roofing, HVAC, and other major systems scheduled for replacement in the next 3 years.
Three years later.
In 2023, the bond totals $762.8 million. Proposition A is the bulk of this, with $698.3 million for school facilities, purchase of necessary sites, and other infrastructure issues. The Proposition B is an additional $50.8 million for technology equipment and technology infrastructure. And then Proposition C, another $13.6 million for renovations to the Don II Performing Arts Center and the South Performing Arts Center. As mentioned previously, in 2021, 2 out of 3 bond measures failed. LISD responded by forming long-range planning committees and citizens advisory committees that were tasked with looking at student access to learning experience, facilities, fiscal responsibility, and changes in population over time. By studying the needs of the district, these committees were able to make recommendations to the board as they move forward in consideration of additional bonds. With a 2023 population of 81,371, Leander is the 49th largest city in Texas. We're currently growing at a rate of 10.1% annually, and our population has increased since the last census by 33.47%. While population totals are important factors in the way that we look at these types of issues, I think it's important in this particular instance to take a look at the dependency ratio. And if you're not familiar with that particular term, the dependency ratio takes a look at the number of dependents who are aged 0 to 14, and then again over the age of 65, and we compare that to the total population of people aged between 15 and 64. This specific indicator gives insight into the number of non-working age people compared to those who are of working age. It's generally used to understand economic burdens of the workforce, and it also has ramifications for taxation. But here, I think it's an important thing to look at because the dependency ratio is also referred to as the youth dependency ratio, which is why I bring it up. When we take a look at this specific demographic as it relates to the city of Leander, although I do believe this actually extends around the Leander area, generally speaking, but when we look at Leander, there is a specific breakdown here that I think is really important to consider. 47.9% of the total age dependency population is that child dependency ratio, or those who are between 0 and 14. Those are also school-aged children. As a result of fiscal management, enrollment growth, and retiring of old debt, Leander ISD will not raise the tax rate in order to pay for this 2023 bond. The interest and sinking portion of the district's property tax rate, which pays for the bond debt, will stay at 33 cents per $100 of assessed property value. Voting on this particular matter will begin on April 24th and will go through May 2nd. So I encourage you, as always, to be involved in your community. If you are registered to vote, please go to the polling stations and let your voice be heard in this particular matter. I think it's very important for us to, as a community, really think about what it is that we're doing in a longer lens. We cannot continue to silo these issues individually. We have to look at the big picture, and when we don't do that, we're cutting our nose off to spite our face. I hope you'll consider some of the points that I've brought up here today and do your own research. Take a look at the actual issues and the things that these bonds are actually addressing. I think it's important to understand exactly where those investments are going and exactly how the district is approaching this particular financial matter. So those are my thoughts on this particular issue. I certainly appreciate you sticking around to hear them out. If you have any kind of feedback, feel free to reach me on the socials. Otherwise, we'll see you next time on Lean and Leander.